Okay, so I'm Anna from Rosa. Really wonderful to have you all here. We've put this session on today because some of you will have been at the keynote session this morning where we talked about centering anti-racism in the women and girls sector. Every organisation in the sector is thinking about what its role is in centering anti-racism in its work and in its organisation. And where we all need to get to is having anti-racism embedded in our entire organisational strategies. And all of us, all of the organisations in the women and girls sector are in a different place in that journey. And the journey starts with actually being able to talk about it. So that's why we've invited Tebussum here today to kind of help those conversations happen more confidently. We're all coming at this from completely different places. So you're all really welcome. Like I say, if you're happy to have your video on and sort of interact, we would love that. And without further ado, I will hand over to Tebussum to lead us through this. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited about running this session, but nervous because it is such a big topic. You know, to actually start talking about something as big as this, as important as this in an hour. You know, it's a bit of an ask, but at the same time, it is important to start the conversation. I do believe that, you know, creating these spaces, these safe spaces about sensitive subjects like this is important. And I hope that's what I can, you know, facilitate this afternoon. This hour is about, you know, having that conversation. I want to share some kind of insight from my kind of expertise in this subject, but it is a space for yourselves. I do want this space for all of you to feel comfortable, to comment, to react, to ask questions, to probe. You know, there's nothing that's going to be judgmental here at all. I'm also conscious and aware that the subject can be sensitive. So for that reason, you know, of course, we will manage that. I will manage that, hopefully. But at the same time, if any of you feel you need to kind of message privately on the chat facility about something that you might be triggered, feel free to do that. Before I kind of dive in, please do use the chat facility throughout the session, you know, to add comments, thoughts, anything that comes to mind related to the subject, because you'll be surprised how many it will resonate with. Apologies. Feel free to ask questions, raise your hand, put it in the chat. Anna and myself will keep an eye on the chat as well. And I hope it will be interactive in the sense, yes, the chat facility, the reactions, but also I will be putting into breakout rooms. So those of you that can put your camera on, as Anna said, it's always good to talk to a person rather than just a name on a black screen. Appreciate not everyone can. There might be in those kind of spaces where you can't. Again, even if in the chat, in the breakout room, use the chat facility to interact. As Anna is doing in the chat, and something that we do is please do introduce yourselves in the chat facility again. It's always, again, good to know who's in the room. There's some very familiar names here. People, some of you women may know me through other training and other spaces I've been involved in the women's sector. I will start off with a very, very quick introduction about myself, because I think that is important, particularly for this subject and the insights I want to give. So my name is Tebussum. I am obviously facilitating this, but I am also the Deputy Chief Executive of a national race equality charity, Action for Race Equality. Action for Race Equality has been around for 30 years, but for 30 years, it was known as BTEG, Black Training Enterprise Group. We went through a whole rebranding kind of phase after the 30th anniversary, partly around, and again, relevant to this conversation, around terminology. Black Training Enterprise Group, apart from, you know, really revisiting what it is we do and be known for, the term Black was something that we were discussing for many years, actually, before lockdown, about how that resonated with communities and even generations. The term Black and how that sits with younger people compared to my generation, compared to my father's generation, what the connotations and the history behind that is, to then move to terms which, you know, through our consultations, Action for Race Equality and how that's at. So we've gone through this rebrand as a charity. As an organisation, National Race Equality Charity, we focus on 3 core areas: criminal justice, education and employment. We do a lot of policy work, top level interactions, trying to make that systemic change, so that top-down kind of approach. But we also do a lot of grassroots work, working directly with young people, particularly parents, schools, prisons, etc. This two-pronged approach that we have is one of the reasons I've stayed at Action for Race Equality for 18 years. I'm proud to be the Deputy CEO at the moment. Outside of the work at the RE, I do a lot of training and facilitation, a lot of which is in the women's sector. So my two personal passions, race and gender, on my career have been for the last 30 years. And just to say also, I've talked about ARE rebranding. Many people in the sector and the career that I've had for 30 years have known me as Tebs. 2-3 months I've actually rebranded myself, or should I say reclaimed my name to Tebussum, which again is relevant to this conversation. I've had to reflect back on why was my name shortened. To some degree, I did that myself because I felt I needed to be noticed and make life easier, but it was also shortened for me, you know, in my younger days. And again, that whole conversation about, you know, the drivers behind, you know, the control, the power in this conversation. So Tebussum is my full name, and I'm proud to start using that. Even I forget sometimes, but it is part of that journey, and recognizing how these kind of things, name being one part of it, has impacted individuals and how that then plays out in and how people progress. So that's just a little bit about me. This session, like I said, I want to try and make it interactive through various sort of platforms, it's not being one, but I'm also going to put you into breakout rooms shortly. I've got a short PowerPoint deck. If I can ask you to put yourselves on mute while, if you're not talking, but like I said, if you've got a question, please do raise your hand at any point. I have got a PowerPoint deck, which I'm more than happy to share afterwards. And I'll be dipping in and out of that. This isn't a training session as such, but at the same time, I do want to kind of get across kind of key messages that are important. And the starting point of that is when I was thinking about this topic, sorry, that's not sharing screen, so I'm going to share screen in a sec. And the title, not necessarily the topic, the title, how to talk about racism. It was so relevant to me because in the last few years, particularly since lockdown, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, it's raised its profile in terms of being on people's agendas, organisations' agendas across sectors, public, private and corporate. And all of a sudden we had this big influx of demand. Can you help us really think about our EDI? Can you really help us think about our anti-racism statements? And honestly, and I'm being very open about this, there was a good percentage, I'd say about 40–50% of those requests that were coming in were coming in because it felt like they needed to do something because everybody else is doing it. And not, you know, that it was almost like, yes, let's do it, make it public, yeah, tick. Another, I'd say 30% were genuine, like realization that we need to be doing something and we want to make this part of a program rather than just a one-off piece of training or a one-off statement. We want to do a whole strategic kind of initiative around this. And, you know, we could spot them. I could spot the difference between those two organizations. And I know you're probably sitting there thinking that's not 100%. The others were already on that journey. So there's a lot of good organizations across sectors that were already on that journey. So it wasn't because of Black Lives Matter or George Floyd murder that triggered the reaction. So we noticed that. But what's also important with that recognition I want to share with you is that a lot of those organizations reaching out with that genuine intention were still very nervous. We're still kind of not quite comfortable to talk about racism. They were happy to talk about unconscious bias. They were happy to talk about cultural competency, which is valid, which is important, of course it is. And it was really interesting that it's only in this last 8 months, I'd say, I had to think about this last night, that I've had more requests coming through for training around anti-racism. And a lot of those are those that have been now on that journey about unconscious bias, cultural competency, managed to get people on that kind of same page, get people comfortable to now move into the kind of more direct, hard-hitting issues, language, you know, etc. So I've even noticed that kind of change. So with that, I do recognize that everyone's at a different place in this journey. unconscious bias is part of the conversation, but it's a more subtle way of approaching it. So this whole thing about talking about racism in this country, shall I say, is still uncomfortable. And we want to dig down into why. Why are people uncomfortable? To then think about how can we talk about racism, which is where I want to get to, partway through this session. So just to start sharing, bear with me while I bring up the PowerPoint. So one sec. Where are you? There you are. Sorry, I talked to myself when I'm doing that. Right, here we go. So that's just me. Emails there if anyone wants to reach out afterwards. I think just very, very quickly, just for a few seconds, it is also important for some people in the room, not necessarily everyone, to actually just take a step back and recognize, what does racism look like? This word, this thing that everyone's talking about, what does it even look like? And importantly, how does it impact? And we'll come on to that later. But it is about the systemic and process and institutional angle. It is about how things are done. It is about, it's not less about the individuals being racist, it's about actually the system being racist. And that's historical, sometimes that's over time. It's about processes. But that's not alone. It is also then about individuals, whether that's in the workplace or in society. Racism plays out through individuals, through the prejudices, through the stereotypes, through discrimination, and direct, explicit racism. Linked to that, yes, it can be passive in the sense that it could also be unconscious. So there may be those individuals that are using language or playing out kind of behaviors explicit, consciously, but there are also those that are saying and doing things unconsciously. And again, through that training, we delve into that a lot more in terms of how does that even come about? How does it play out in how we behave in our teams, in our recruitment practice, both on an individual level, but also through the process that we've inherited sometimes. We've also then got the historical racism. And again, without going into detail, whether it's from the slave trade, whether it's through policies and laws, there is a lot of history just in this country. And we're recognizing where that is, and especially with those organizations some of us may be aligned to and working with in partnership or working for, what's the history behind that? Do I recognize that? Are we owning that? How are we even reflecting back to that? I was at the Royal Chartered Institute for Surveyors the other day, doing some collaboration work with them, and of course there's history, but to actually listen to how they're bringing out surveyors, architects from Black minority backgrounds to the forefront. Because if you go into that building, you see statues, you see paintings of white men, white old men, and that's it. But in the books and everywhere else, there's reference to Black people. Where are they? And just listening to the journey they've been on to actually get to that point, to now what they're going to do about it, is really, really fascinating. But I know there's lots of organizations, institutes doing that. There is, as I said, the blatant, and again, whether this is in society, through social media, colleagues even, family, friends. I know a lot of people that have said to me that during the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter period, a lot of people have kind of stopped being friends with people because of recognizing there is blatant racism underlying some of the friendships. And it's come out through those conversations. So recognizing where that is, who's doing that. And then lastly, not understanding privilege. I think that in itself leads to racism, because if you don't recognize where that privilege lays, and I do want to touch on this shortly, does lead to that. I've got a link here to, sorry, I should have renamed that, but it's a link to Renia Delodge. She speaks for about 11 minutes in an interview about a little bit about her book, Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race, but within that conversation about that whole thing about white privilege and the lack of even acknowledgement of racism around us, which, linked to all of this, the systemic, the individual, the passive, the recent government report, which actually said, there is no such thing as institutional racism within government departments. which was a blow to us, for us, myself working in Action for Race Equality, my colleagues, my CEO, who've been working in this kind of field for decades, to be told, actually, you're making it up, it's not real. That was a real pushback. And it's not the first time, it won't be the last time. And it's hard to get back into the saddle sometimes, 20 years after Stephen Lawrence, to still be talking about the same stuff, to look at reports that were written and recommendations that were written years ago, to still be saying the same things and not being heard. That all sounds quite negative, but what I suppose I'm sitting here still being optimistic. We've had a sea change of dialogue, we've had a sea change of reaction, we've had momentum through Black Lives Matter and the younger generation wanting to do something about this, not just talking. So for that reason, I still am optimistic that we are going to see change, but at the same time, still emphasizing that this conversation about talking about racism, it's got to be done at different levels and different stages, not stages, but from different perspectives. And that is that me, myself, and I. It's got to start with me. Anyone in the room that's here, it's got to start with us. Recognizing our mindsets, our behaviors, how they play out. Because if they're not challenged, if they're not recognized, they get challenged, to then be challenged and changed, they will then become part of cultures within teams and organizations. And if they're not then interrupted, over time, they will become cemented. People coming into the organization will then also adopt those kind of cultures. And that's where it leads to that institutional and even systemic discrimination. So yes, we've got to talk about the systemic change. Yes, we've got to dismantle and unlearn some of that, a lot of that, but at the same time, it is about us as individuals. I will also say that this conversation, I look at it from, I suppose, different lenses, in the sense that, who is this conversation aimed at? I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. Because on one hand, it is aimed at those people find it difficult to talk about racism because they're not a person of color. Because being white, actually it's uncomfortable. There's lots of reasons, and I'm going to talk about them shortly, about why people will be uncomfortable. But I also want to point out that actually why racism isn't talked about by people of color, like brown, minoritized people, why those people, why I or someone like me would find it uncomfortable to talk about racism. So it's not just about the white people, it's actually your colleagues, your team members, your stakeholders that would be of black minoritized background. Why are they uncomfortable about talking about racism? What's going on there? So it's got to be looked at from both angles. And I will again give a chance to kind of delve into that in a short while. It's also about looking at from point of view of the person and the people, and that as individuals, person to person. This conversation about racism, is it happening with my colleagues? Why isn't it happening? But also the conversation about racism, which Anna talked about on a strategic level. Within organizations, is this now being embedded or developed as a strategy, as policy? Are we looking at it as change? And the two are combined, of course. You can't separate people from systems, you can't, of course, but think about it, when we're having those personal conversations over lunch or over a drink, what's going on there? What are the dynamics? Am I able to join in a conversation? Why am I not able to? On that personal level. And then on a more strategic level, for those of you involved, am I involved? Am I able to empower and enable people to talk about it from a strategic point of view? And that long game that we talk about. So there's all these different angles that this conversation needs to be happening from. I hope that's all making sense. I'm conscious I'm talking at you a lot, but I think that context and understanding, all these different angles and the complications of this conversation are important. Sorry, I'm dipping into the slide deck ago. So yeah, that's what I've just talked about. We need to look at it through the two different lenses, through the person with a person of color, but also everybody else. And it may be two separate conversations, quite importantly, I think. I know colleagues, I know people that feel that if they bring something up, it's almost like they have that reputation of like, oh, it's her again, or it's him again, or it's that again. And we need to kind of manage that and really think about what's going on and what the impact of that is. if someone is being shut down around any of these topics, what's the impact? And we'll again come on to that in a sec. What I'm going to do, let me see how many of you in the room. Okay, that's not too bad. I'm going to put you into breakout rooms. So I know, like I said, some of you may not be able to contribute depending on where you are. I hope most of you will be able to put your cameras on. I'm going to put you into breakout rooms, and I want you to just have that conversation to start this before we get to the solution part. Why is it difficult for people to talk about racism? And if you can, from both those angles, general, i.e. white people struggling, and actually people of colour struggling. Why is it difficult for some? Not necessarily all, obviously I'm generalising here. There are some people that have that confidence, have that space, and can. But in the main, there are some people, and there may be some of you here in the room, it may be those conversations you've had. I'd like you to, in your subgroups, have that conversation. I'm just gonna put you into 4 groups. And I'm going to give you 10 minutes to have that conversation. I'd like one of you in each group just to bring back just the gist of the conversation. I don't expect, you know, the full list of the conversation, but a gist of kind of key messages that will come out through your conversation. I'd appreciate if someone could nominate themselves to do that, just to kind of speed up. And when we come back, is to then move on from, okay, if these are the challenges, if these are the barriers, if these are the kind of reasons, I then want to kind of talk to you about, oh, okay, what can we do? How can we be true allies in this conversation? So if that's okay, I'm going to put you into breakout rooms. You'll be nudged in. If anybody feels they don't want to be there, come back to the main group. That's absolutely fine. And just to say, in your breakout rooms, you're not being recorded. So in terms of just having that safe space to have that conversation, be quite candid, feel free. Do respect each other's views, do respect each other's voices. I will see you back in 10 minutes. I hope you found that space useful, of those a few minutes. I think it is important to just take stock and reflect back on why we've been having this conversation. Why is it difficult? So we'll just spend a couple of minutes just kind of getting quick feedback, and then I want to move on to kind of, you know, how do we talk about racism? Room one, who was feeding that? That was a room with Henrique, Lindsay, Miriam, no, not Miriam, Rizwana and Sam.
I'll feedback some, but please jump in if I've missed out, because I took some notes when other people were talking. So we were talking about how the discussion doesn't arise, because when you do bring it up, when you do bring up racism, people who have never experienced it tend to be very defensive. So they see, even though you're bringing up something that's racist and you're trying to have a conversation, they see it as a personal attack.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't feel that they're not equipped to be able to deal with that. So they haven't got the confidence. So what they try and do is to try and distract from the conversation. So they'll say, oh, you're playing the race card again. Mm-hmm. So, you know, you can't win your argument, so you're playing the race card. And they don't appreciate, actually, the race card is because there is racism there. And you're not giving it an excuse. So the way we need to start these conversations is by supporting people so that they feel more confident, so that they feel they've got some understanding, so they can have those conversations. So there's education needed, but some of it is willful. So some of it is institutionalized racism, and it's something that they've always spoken in one way, and it's how they've always lived, and it's generational and all the rest of it. But some of it is willful, and there are some people who will get very cross and angry about people who say, look, this is racism and there's inequality here. Mm-hmm. And they get on their high horse, and why they're being like that, and it's extremes. So some people have extreme views. Those aren't just something they've learned. It's something they want to be.
Yeah.
And it's somebody was saying also, a lot of it might be because there's guilt and shame, because they haven't accepted their privilege. So in the background, they might know well, there is something, and I am privileged, but they haven't accepted that.
Mm.
But they then don't know what to do with it. So there's guilt and shame there. And quite often it's individual action. Those people act individually, but actually the whole system is responsible for that. And the system does not value most people. So the ones with privilege feel that, they'll say, well, it's not racism, it's class.
Mm.
So white working class have got less privilege than black people. And it's because they are not supported by the system either. So they use that. And I was saying, there's no discussion in schools about this. There's no real education. And imperialism is never touched upon. And the effects of that are still being played out today. And people's lives are still affected now. And if you look at black slavery and the difference between black slavery from Africa to the Americas, those slaves were dehumanized, whereas slaves in the Middle East and in other places, they had power. They could rise to high levels. They were paid. They were privileged. So people don't realize when they say, oh, but the blacks were selling slaves to each other, or the Middle East were having slaves. They don't understand that difference.
Thank you, Donna.
Generational abuse, the trauma is still being felt by people today.
Yeah, thank you. I can't believe in 10 minutes you covered so much ground in the group, so thank you for that feedback. Quickly jumping on to room 2, just to again very quickly hear about what are the reasons why people don't talk about race. If there's anything to add to what's already been said, that'd be helpful. Room 2, which was Joe, Kelly, Khalda, Steph, and Stephanie. Hi, Steph.
Hi.
Hi, Joe.
I'm sorry.
Are you feeding back? Summary? Yeah.
I was noticed as taking notes, so I got landed with explaining. I think at an individual level, our common the common point really was about fear. So in speaking about racism, there was a fear about getting the language wrong and being judged badly for that. There was something about what reaction did I get last time? Was I responded to positively and helpfully, or did I get a negative response? And that then affects your next attempt. There was something about, do I feel in a safe place to talk about racism from a personal perspective? And then the fears about what the listener might be thinking. And that links in then to the comment from the service provider about a service that is there to help women victims, survivors of domestic abuse. And she said that they're getting more racism leveled against them as an organization and against women, for instance, who are in the police station wanting support. And in terms of being treated negatively and in that terrible way, that it's got worse. They seem to be going backwards in terms of having been able to work with other agencies, but not so easy in the past couple of years. And we tried to work out what that might be about. And it's as if one idea was that people have been working from home, get isolated, get frustrated, get burnt out. Some couldn't be bothered. And that if you're more insular, as we all have been, then it's sort of easier to justify the structures as they are at the time. And pushing against a racist reaction requires energy, and it requires more energy from those with least resources. Certainly, if we're going back to the comment from the service provider. So I think fear, different aspects of fear.
100%. There's again that conversation, if you delve into it much more, and then think, and again, that solution approach that we want to have, knowing that this is one of the reasons why people hesitate. And again, it could be the white person or the person of color having that fear, as you said quite rightly, about how was it reacted to last time, how was it received, what is it we can do now as an organization, what is it I can do as a leader or as a manager to allay some of those fears. And that's where we need to get to. Okay, room 3, Christina, Emily, Shagufta, and Vic. Who's feeding mic?
Hi, it's me. I'm going to try and do this super quickly because I'm aware we're probably getting short on time. So absolutely had similar conversations. I think we spoke about that language and terminology changes as well. One person in our group spoke about the European and American context and how that could be a little bit different, doing work with sort of European folks and some of that fear that can come in, which can lead to a paralysis. We then spoke around sort of frameworks for enabling discussions. So if we create cultures where, a culture within our organisation where challenge is encouraged and expected, and we position ourselves as a learning organisation, so that there's goodwill, and that if we get it wrong, please challenge each other, and some of that to break down some of those barriers. And the other thing I brought, and I'll own this because this is a really tricky one, and I doubt there'll be time to even go into this today, is some of the pushback we've experienced when we've been working around the issues that, and I hope I'm using acceptable language here, that Black and brown people experience. So when we're looking at more kind of colour-based racism, for want of a better term, I don't have the right terminology here yet, and I can only apologise for that. But pushback from other groups around white minority groups, Gypsy, Roma, Travelling communities, and people, around anti-Semitism, and sometimes Islamophobia, and how are we incorporating all of that, looking at the Equality Act and what's in there, racism, how power and privilege and power and prejudice comes in. So a really kind of complex area that we're grappling with, of like, racism is enormous, and how do we encompass the difference, the huge differences, the subtle nuances, and the difference of experience. And actually talking about anti-racism is talking about an enormous thing, and that has left me at times feeling very stuck, confused, and lost about how on earth we can try and do this work.
And it's interesting you say that. I've had many senior managers in big corporates say something similar, and because they find it so big, they kind of park it, stick their head in the sand and think, I'll deal with it later, it's too big for me, I can't manage it. Because it is complex, it is multi-layered, but that's exactly where we need to move away from, and actually have the roadmap of like breaking it down, different angles, different perspectives, and actually have that roadmap to talk about it and change. Very quickly, Emily and Louise, you were in a room together. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll be really, really quick. We did talk about a lot of the stuff that's already been mentioned, and then also about the guilt, because you're obviously, as a white person, benefiting from that system, and yeah, it can feel guilty and uncomfortable to think about that, to tackle it. Not knowing how ignorant you are, maybe, and knowing that you may say the wrong thing. And what else did we say? Based on previous reactions as well, but that's already been spoken about. And Kay put some really interesting points in the chat as well about how, as a person of colour, it's hard to have the conversation because often behaviours and attributes that she uses to make herself fit in come from that place of relative privilege and positioning herself in a white dominant environment, and then talking about that can feel like bringing down the armour that's actually protected her in that system as well. Yeah. Just, yeah, we spoke about a lot, but that's it in summary.
Thank you so much. Like I said, and it's been echoed as well, this is a massive subject, but I hope those 10 minutes got the conversation going and actually recognizing, and some things that have just been said out loud, we're probably aware of, but actually cementing that as actually this is real. As Camilla was saying in our group, that actually sometimes people think this is something that's affecting someone else somewhere else, not on my doorstep. but actually the reality is it's on my doorstep, it's in my team, it's within the organization. I'm just going to very quickly jump back into my PowerPoint. Give me a second. So I've got a slide that hopefully summarizes a lot of what you just talked about. Definitely echoes there, the denial is there, fear of victim blaming, people saying I don't see color, not wanting to confront or expose or explore bias, whether it's personal or within teams. There's a lot of there, so I'm not going to go through each point, self-explanatory, but hopefully they resonate with what you talked about, but a few more things maybe as well. This goes into kind of that conversation about white fragility, exactly those kind of statements that give pushback. I don't see colour, I see everyone equal, that kind of statement. And that's a get out clause. How do we manage that when someone says that? Going back to one of the points from the feedback, is people are not equipped with the confidence or even the knowledge of, like, if one of my colleagues says that, what should I say in response? Do I just nod my head and agree? I think, oh, that's really good. Or what should I be saying? This is one of those conversations I'd like all of you to take back to your next team meeting, for example, and actually say, you know, put this list up perhaps and say, look, you know, these are kind of some of the things that get presented. If this was said on your watch, what would you say? How would you react? And there's no right or wrong. It is really exactly what we said about creating a safe space for people to explore options of what would I say? What would my reaction be? What would my team members say? What would my manager encourage us to do? What's the protocols and policies to question some of these things? So yeah, the thing about white fragility, I think, is important. Things like microaggressions don't exist. So it doesn't help when government reports and government departments say, oh, unconscious bias doesn't exist, that training is a waste of time, etc., etc. We can agree or disagree on that. That's not the point. But the fact that senior officials, people with power, again, are almost like creating the narrative and dictating the rights and wrongs of what part of the conversations we should and shouldn't be having. That's what we need to question. Black people are racist too, and there is a conversation around colorism within, you know, our communities. Of course there is, but is that the tone that should be used? Actually, let's default away or retract away from the issue that we should be talking about and actually start blaming something else and someone else. Why must we always talk about race? What about homophobia? What about gender? What about this? They're all important, of course they are. But if you look statistically, the data is evident that when we look at sort of intersectionality, it's the race factor that actually causes more disparities, whether it's employment, housing, etc., etc. Even COVID was very explicit about that. So in terms of like, how do we talk about race? I found this in a book that I was reading earlier this year, well, a few months ago actually, and I just thought, right, I've got to reference this. It's a no-brainer. The acronym in itself is race, can't forget it. It's to recognize, first of all, have this conversation, recognize that actually we need to have this conversation, we need to do something about it, we need to look at our, so whether it's individual training, supervision, you know, from that point of view, to the policies, the processes, the system, the history, all the things I talked about earlier, recognize and actually admit that there is something that we need to do. There are changes that we need to make. You'll be surprised how many people are not there yet. Yes, having the conversation because everybody else is having it is one thing, but having the conversation so it's relevant to my workspace is another. And I know there's some really, really good examples as well, so I'm not completely knocking it. Some really good examples of initiatives. However, even there's kind of an air to caution because some of those initiatives are implemented where the burden is then on people of colour to be part of the working groups, etc., which might choice is absolutely fine. But the burden where I'm looking at, especially in corporate sector, it's there without the added resource. It's voluntary. We'd like you to be part of this working group looking at, you know, different aspects of diversity. Great. But then the commitment needs to also be followed through with recognition, whether that's time off in lieu, whether it's extra pay, whatever, to recognize people are giving their time to enable that change. To then analyze what needs to be done. To analyze whether the blind spots may be, to analyze actually how we need to kind of move forward. And that's part of that roadmap I was kind of talking about. To commit, And that again, it's like we've had the conversation, we've got the data. Quite often, unfortunately, again, we see those reports coming out and then nothing. And for me, I'm very much that kind of that solution-focused kind of person. I've got to find results and answers and all the rest of it. And you can't do that without commitment. And that commitment's got to be definitely from, you know, senior management, trustee level. It's got to be top down, and it's got to be vocal. It's got to be visual, but it's also got to be commitment across the organisation. Everyone's got to own this, and one of the ways to do that is actually make sure everyone's part of the conversation when designing this roadmap. So it's not just something created out there by an external consultant or by trustees to then dictate, right, we've got this strategy, next 3 years we've got to do all this stuff, which might be great. But if people were not part of that conversation to help co-create that, the ownership is going to be at a different level. And that's really, really important to make sure that everyone is committed and actually taking responsibility of their own behaviours on a personal, team and organisational level. And the last part, which is definitely touches on what was just talked about in the group, is that empower. How can we empower people to feel comfortable, to allay some of those fears, to have the knowledge about what this topic even is about? I mean, that very first slide about, you know, where does racism impact? To some people, that means nothing because they've not had the conversation. They may not have read that book. They may not have watched some of the things I might be watching. So what are the resources that you're giving the women that you're working with to empower them with this topic, which is massive? And for some, again, exactly what somebody said in one of in the feedback, for some, if you're oblivious to, you know, some of the behaviors and actions and experiences of racism, if you don't know it, if you don't experience it because you don't have brown skin, you probably not even notice some of the stuff, because, you know, why would you? If somebody's sitting, I mean, I was in a restaurant and, you know, some young black men were told to pay for their bill up front, racial profiling. So somebody who's not brown or black, that would have just gone past them, like, what's the big deal? It is a big deal. So all of these things under this acronym, which I think is brilliant. I have referenced the book, an amazing book actually, the Anti-Racist Organisation. Do have a look at it if you've got time. But also, again, that whole thing about committing and empowering. Is that a book that you'd personally need to buy out of your pocket, or is it something that the organisation should buy and be shared? Little things like that need to also be kind of just, you know, thought about. It is, in terms of moving on to kind of like how we move on, it is about understanding that this is about racial trauma and having a racial a trauma-informed approach. It's been touched on already by some of the things that have been said. Acknowledge and call out the pain caused by racist beliefs and actions. Listen, actually believe what's being said rather than, you know, oh, you're using the race card kind of approach. It might not be said as explicitly as that, you know, you're using the race card. It may be just, oh, we'll deal with this later, or I'll bring it up in the next supervision. It's kind of sidelined. That in itself adds to that trauma and that impact. So acknowledge and call out the pain. You can only call out the pain if you notice it, and you can only notice it if it's talked about and actually those experiences are heard and the stories are shared. You need to create those spaces. Centre Black voices, but without putting the burden on Black individuals. Of course, this is contextual. It may be that actually some colleagues might want to be front and centre because they're so passionate, fine. But just recognising actually that's not always the case. Don't take that for granted. And then really think about whose voices need to be there, whose lenses are missing. And you know, this might be part of the wider EDI strategy, fine. But don't dilute the EDI conversation by not separating race and racism. Actually listen to the voices of those most impacted, and it may not be about experiences in the organisation, it may be. And again, this is something I do quite a lot of, is delving into organisations and allowing spaces for voices, about experiences within organisations. And that in itself says a lot about actually what are the protocols, what are the safe spaces, what about whistleblowing, what are the processes that now need to be kind of looked at so people feel comfortable that and that they are going to actually be listened and heard. Take personal discomfort to engage in dialogue out. You know, this is not about you. If you feel uncomfortable, take that out. This is about the person who's been impacted. And again, I don't need you to teach you to suck eggs if that's the right saying, because you know exactly what that means when you're working with women. who've been traumatized, domestic abuse, etc. Take responsibility for your own education, examine your understanding, and again, whether this you is, I said right at the beginning, it's about me, myself, and I. What can I do? And this might be outside of my workspace as much as in the workspace. Difficult to separate. So what am I reading? What am I watching? Have you as an organization got maybe an interactive watch and read list that's being shared around? Is there kind of a space where you know, the books that I like, or videos, or the TED talk, not sorry, the YouTube link I sent earlier, is there a place where people can put into that and actually share that in the team meeting? Shall we watch a video together? That Rennie, I did a large 10-minute video. Maybe that should be something we watch together. Let's have a conversation. Little things like that make a big difference because it starts creating that safe space. The don'ts are just as important, of course. And again, echoed from what was said before, don't remain silent in the face of injustice. But again, that links back to giving yourself and others the confidence to not be silent. What should be said? What's that approach that could be taken without it being an attack on individuals? I quite echo this point about sometimes we need to bring the issue to the table, not the person. The person might be also important because it's the person behaving in a certain way, of course, but by bringing the issue to the table first, more likely to have that conversation to then talk about individuals, which might be a different space, might be supervision, it might be other protocols. Don't be defensive. And that usually comes out of that fear that we talked about. Don't expect others to educate you, especially those people from the Black, Asian backgrounds, minority backgrounds. Again, I'm not going to read to all of this, only because I want to jump and I'm to the next slide, and I'm conscious of the time. It takes us onto the conversation, and again, this is a whole session in itself about allyship and true allyship, not being the savior. The savior is that person that I can solve your problem, I can speak on your behalf. What is true allyship? Really understanding that, having that conversation. I have managed to put up one slide just to kind of show you the difference between kind of the performative kind of allyship, which is what we're kind of used to. It's kind of the quick fixes, and it's what we've kind of seen in the sectors plural for many, many years, versus what authentic allyship is. So we're used to mentoring, for example, which is great. I'm not knocking it, but to actually have authentic allyship is about that sponsorship. It's about, am I in that position of power? Am I in that position where I can open up doors? Am I in that space where I can actually advocate for someone and bring them on board? So what is my position? When I take on placements where volunteers, etc., of course they come into the office, they learn about what we do. But if I'm out somewhere, so I was at JP Morgan offices the other day, great space to be in. This young person who, in terms of social mobility, because she's Black and she feels actually she's never going to get this chance, she hasn't got the connections, taking her along, exposing her to these opportunities, introducing to people that she would never ever get a chance to, and these were her words. That's the kind of approach that we need to start thinking about. What is it we're doing? Cultural fit versus cultural add. And the difference is that thing about belonging. It was talked about, again, mentioned very briefly. You know, do people have to conform, whether it's about the name, changing the name, whether it's how we dress, whether it's, you know, me understanding all the different types of kind of wines and champagnes. I'm not a drinker, so therefore to conform and to fit in, I need to do that. What is it your organisation is doing to help people fit in? And that belonging, again, is a word that you need to actually have a conversation about. Is your interpretation of that word belonging the same as others in the room? What is it we're doing? Again, I could spend a lot longer on that, but just to plant the seed, I suppose. Conscious of the time, just going to finish on this slide. I felt, you know, this is an image I've used, and you'll get this PowerPoint, so feel free to kind of, you know, zoom in on this. But it is this journey from us, for us as a individual, from that fear zone to that growth zone. And there's, you know, there's lots of tips here, and the pathway is quite explicit. I thought it was a really, really good visual to share with you, because a lot of people I work with are somewhere in these zones. And it's asking ourselves, where am I now? What do I need to do to get to the next zone, What about my team? So, you know, it's a visual, it's a great visual, I think. Don't just use it as like, oh yeah, this is great. What I would suggest is like, really think about how can you use that as a tool as a team discussion. You might get people to just pin where they feel they are now, to then ask the question, right, what would you need? What can I do to empower you to feel more confident? I know I'm going to have to stop there because it's gone 2 o'clock. I'm really sorry I've run over time, but I hope that's kind of allowed some space for a difficult conversation, for a very deep, complex conversation. I hope you found some of the tips useful, not just from myself, but even from the conversations you've had in your subgroups. I am going to stop it there. Thank you so much for being here, being present, and your contributions. I hope to see some, if not all of you, somewhere else. I'm sure I will in the sector. Have a lovely day, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Tebussum, as well. Thanks, everyone. For those that haven't left, please do join us just in the closing session, which Rebecca is running. We need to go in through the lobby to re-enter, but we'd really welcome you there. And thanks again, Tebussum. It was fantastic.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.